Imagine strapping yourself into a seat, looking out through a small round window at the Earth, and knowing, with complete certainty, that you are seeing it for the last time. This is not a scene from a film. It is the most likely reality facing the first human beings who ever travel to Mars. We talk about going to Mars as though it were a trip, the kind of thing you come back from. But the physics tells a colder story. The crossing itself, 6 to 9 months soaked in radiation strong enough to end an astronaut's career in a single journey, quietly begins to take the body apart. The bones thin by as much as 2% every month. The heart, with no gravity left to fight, shrinks by nearly a fifth. And the world waiting at the far end has no magnetic shield, air you could never breathe, and a cold that would kill you in minutes. Tonight, we're going to follow that journey all the way to its end, and by the time we are finished, you will understand exactly why the first people to reach Mars will almost certainly never come home, and why that may not even be the hardest part of their fate. Get comfortable. If you're the kind of person who likes having a comfortable certainty gently taken apart, a quick like and subscribe genuinely helps this channel reach more curious minds like you. Because by the end of this, the word colonize will never sound quite so simple again. Now let's slowly settle into the dark. There is a moment, still hypothetical, that a small number of people alive right now may actually live through. It begins very quietly. A person straps themselves into a seat inside a spacecraft that is about to leave the ground, and in the last minutes before the engines light, they look out through a small round window at the world they were born on. And somewhere in that stillness, they understand something. Not as an idea, but as a fact settling into the body the way cold settles into a room. They understand that they are almost certainly seeing this place for the last time. They boarded knowing. Hold on to that phrase tonight, because we are going to come back to it more than once. They boarded knowing. We have been in love with Mars for a very long time. It is the one other world in the sky that has ever looked, even a little, like home. It has polar caps that grow and shrink with the seasons, just as ours do. It has a day that is only about 40 minutes longer than ours, so a clock built for Earth would very nearly work there. It has weather and clouds and a sky and mountains and dry riverbeds carved by water that ran billions of years ago. For more than a century, when people imagine leaving Earth and actually living somewhere else, they imagine Mars. The imagination came first, long before any of the engineering, and it has never really let go. And now the imagination has turned into plans. Space agencies talk openly about sending human beings to Mars in the late 2030s and into the 2040s. Private companies talk about something much larger than a visit. They talk about settlement. They talk about cities. They talk about a second home for our species, a place to stand if something ever goes wrong with the first one. You have almost certainly seen the artwork. Domed greenhouses glowing against a rust-coloured horizon, figures in clean white suits walking across the sand as if they were on a beach. It is a beautiful picture, and it is meant to be. It is meant to make you feel that this is the next natural step, that we are simply walking through a door that has been standing open all along. Tonight I want to walk very slowly through that same door with you, but I want us to look at what is actually on the other side of it. Because underneath all of that hopeful artwork, there is a fact that the paintings never show you, and it is this. The first crewed mission to Mars is almost certainly not a trip. A trip has a return. A trip is something you come back from. What the physics and the biology quietly describe instead is closer to a departure with no arrival back home. A one-way passage, not because anyone chose to make it one way out of some grim sense of drama, but because the human body and the planet itself may leave no other option. That is the question I want to sit with for the next couple of hours. What is the actual fate of the first human beings to reach Mars? Not the fate in the brochure, the real one. And I want to say clearly before we go any further that this is not a story I am telling you to frighten you. There is no jump scare coming. This is a slow, patient look at something genuinely strange and genuinely heavy. The kind of thing that is easier to think about in the dark, at the edge of sleep, when the mind is soft enough to hold a large idea without flinching. So let yourself get comfortable. We are going to take the long way around. Let us start with the smallest, most human part of it, the person in the seat. Because whoever they are, they will be extraordinary. Every time there has been a real opportunity to volunteer for a mission like this, even a mission openly described as possibly one way, The applications have poured in by the thousands. There is no shortage of people willing to go. That fact alone should tell you something about us as a species, something restless and reaching and a little bit reckless. But willingness is not the same as possibility. A person can want with their whole heart to do a thing that their own body will not allow them to undo. And that gap between the wanting and the undoing is where this entire story lives. Because here is the quiet truth we're going to uncover together tonight, one layer at a time. The journey to Mars changes the traveller, not in a poetic way, in a physical, measurable, cellular way. The months in space rewrite the body along curves that all point in the same direction, away from Earth, away from the ability to ever come back to Earth safely. And then, at the end of that changed journey, Mars itself is waiting, and Mars is not a soft place to land. It is one of the most hostile environments a human being could ever try to survive in. So the traveller is caught between two facts that close in from opposite sides. The trip out makes return dangerous. The destination makes staying nearly impossible to do well. Doomed is a heavy word, and I am not going to use it lightly. But by the end of tonight, I think you will understand exactly why it keeps coming up. It helps to understand why Mars, of all the worlds, holds this grip on us, because that fascination is part of the trap too. It is the bait. Look up at the night sky, and most of what you see is utterly, obviously unreachable. Stars that are furnaces, gas giants that would crush you, moons of ice and poison. But Mars is different. Mars is close enough to visit within a human lifetime. It has a surface you could stand on, ground that looks like a desert on Earth, a sky that turns colours at dawn and dusk. Long ago, astronomers looking through early telescopes convinced themselves they saw straight lines across its face, and imagined canals, and imagined the engineers who must have dug them, and the whole world fell in love with the idea of neighbours next door. There were newspaper stories more than a century ago speculating in earnest about the civilization on Mars. The neighbours turned out to be a fantasy, but the longing that invented them never went away. It simply changed its shape, from a hope of finding life there to a hope of bringing our own. And that longing is not foolish. There is a genuinely serious argument underneath it, one that has nothing to do with adventure and everything to do with survival. Right now, every human being who has ever lived, every work of art, every language, every memory of our entire species sits on a single planet. And single points can fail. An asteroid could strike, as one did to end the age of the dinosaurs. Far in the future, our own aging sun will swell and grow hostile to life on Earth. To have everything in one place is, in the coldest terms, to keep all of it at risk at once. Spreading to a second world would be a kind of insurance for the species, a second basket for our fragile eggs. This is the strongest reason the dream of Mars refuses to die, and it is a reason worth taking seriously. But notice the shape of it. The argument is about the survival of humanity as a whole, the abstract distant species. It says nothing about the survival of the individual human beings we would actually send. And that gap between what is good for the species and what happens to the person in the seat is exactly the gap we're going to spend tonight exploring. So picture the person in the seat one more time before we leave the launch pad behind. They are looking out the window at a blue world. Everyone they have ever loved is down there. Every person they will ever love is down there. The engines are about to light, and they boarded knowing. Keep them in your mind as we go, because everything we are about to talk about, every number and every finding and every strange fact, is really about what is happening to that one person, and to the handful of people beside them, as they leave the only place in the universe that was ever built for them. The first thing that happens is that the door closes, and on this particular journey the door does not work the way any door you have ever walked through works. We will start there. We tend to think of a journey as something we can reverse. You drive somewhere, and if you forget something, you can turn the car around. You fly across an ocean, and if there is an emergency, the plane can land or turn back or another plane can come. Even the astronauts who have gone to the moon carried this reassurance with them. The moon is close. If something went badly wrong on the way, home was only a few days behind them, always there, always reachable. The trip to Mars breaks this assumption completely, and it breaks it before the crew has even left Earth's neighbourhood. Understanding why is the first step into the trap, so let us take it slowly. Mars and Earth are both moving. They are both circling the sun, but at different speeds and different distances, like two runners on two different lanes of an enormous track, one on the inside, one much farther out. Earth, on the inside lane, moves faster. Mars, on the outside, moves slower. This means the distance between the two planets is always changing. Sometimes they are on the same side of the Sun and relatively close. Sometimes they are on opposite sides of the Sun, separated by the entire width of both orbits. At their closest, Mars is a little under 55 million kilometers away. At their farthest, it is more than 400 million kilometers away, with the Sun itself sitting in the middle blocking the path. The distance is not a single number. It breathes in and out over time. Because of this constant motion, you cannot simply leave for Mars whenever you feel ready. You have to wait for the two planets to line up in a way that makes the trip possible with the amount of fuel a rocket can actually carry. That alignment, that open window, comes around only about once every 26 months. A little more than 2 years between chances. This is the first bar of the cage, and it is made of nothing but orbital geometry. If you miss the window, you wait more than 2 years for the next one. There is no leaving early. There is no leaving late. You go when the sky says you can go, or you do not go at all. Once the crew does launch, the crossing itself takes something like 6 to 9 months, depending on exactly how the planets are arranged and how much fuel is spent. Think about what that number really means for a moment. 6 to 9 months is not a voyage you abort. By the time the crew is a few weeks out, turning around would take just as long as continuing. There is no nearer shore, there is no coast guard, there is no other ship in the shipping lane because there is no shipping lane. Once they are committed to the trajectory, they are riding a curve through empty space that was calculated months in advance, and that curve does not have an exit ramp. This is what I mean when I say the door locks. It is not a metaphor about willpower, it is arithmetic. On the way out there is no down and there is no back. Hold on to that phrase too. No down on the way and no back on the way home. We will find out later that it is far more literal than it sounds. It is worth understanding how the crossing actually works, because it explains why turning back is not just difficult, but essentially meaningless. A spacecraft does not fly to Mars in a straight line, aimed at where Mars is, engines burning the whole way like a car on a highway. There is nowhere near enough fuel for that. Instead, the ship gives itself one great push near Earth, and then it coasts, engines silent, along a long curving arc through space, a path shaped by the Sun's gravity, timed so that the ship and Mars arrive at the same point at the same moment months later. The ship is not being driven to Mars, it is being thrown, like a stone along a precise curve, and it falls the rest of the way on its own. Almost the entire journey is spent drifting, powerless, following a line drawn by physics before launch. This is why there is no turning around in any real sense. There is no engine running that you could simply point the other way. To change the path at all would take another enormous push of fuel that the ship does not carry, and even then Earth would no longer be where it was when you left, because Earth too keeps moving around the Sun. By the time you are a month into the coast, going back would mean plotting a whole new curving arc to chase down a planet that had swung far along its own orbit, a maneuver requiring fuel you do not have, arriving after a journey as long as simply continuing. The crew is not choosing to go forward rather than back. Forward is the only direction that physics leaves open. They are committed the instant the first push ends and the coasting begins, and then there is the silence, or rather, the delay. We are so used to instant communication that we forget it depends on distance. When you talk to someone on the far side of Earth, there is a delay of only a tiny fraction of a second, so small you never notice it. That delay exists because even light, the fastest thing in the universe, takes time to travel. Light is astonishingly quick over human distances and heartbreakingly slow over planetary ones. A radio signal from Mars travelling at the speed of light takes somewhere between 3 minutes and 22 minutes to reach Earth, depending on where the two planets are in their orbits, and that is only one direction. For an answer to come back, you double it. So a simple question, and its reply can be separated by anywhere from 6 minutes to 44 minutes of pure waiting. Sit with what that does to a human being. There can be no phone call home, not a real one. You could speak, and then wait, and finally hear a reply to something you said half an hour ago, addressed to a version of you that no longer exists in the same moment. Every conversation becomes a pair of letters crossing a dark ocean. Worse, in an emergency, there is no one to call at all. If a piece of equipment fails, if a fire starts, if a medical crisis unfolds, the crew cannot be talked through it in real time by experts on Earth, because by the time the experts even hear about the problem, it may be 20 minutes old, and by the time their advice arrives, it is 20 minutes older still. The people on that ship must be able to save themselves, alone, or not be saved. That is a kind of solitude no human being in history has ever experienced. Even the loneliest sailor, even the polar explorer buried in a tent in a storm, was closer to help than this. So the door locks in 3 ways at once. The orbits only open a path every 26 months. The crossing is too long to reverse, and the distance stretches every cry for help into a delay that makes rescue impossible. Before the crew has felt a single physical effect of the journey, before a single one of the changes we're about to discuss has begun, they are already beyond return in the most basic logistical sense. They are already, in the plainest terms, on their own. But logistics is only the outer wall. The distance locks the door from the outside. What we're going to look at next is far stranger and far more intimate, because it locks the door from the inside. It happens quietly, invisibly, in the very cells of the people making the crossing, and it begins the moment they leave the shelter of the earth behind. There is something waiting in the empty space between the worlds, something you cannot see or feel, and it is already passing through them. On Earth, you are protected by 2 shields so constant and so silent that you have never once thought to thank them. The first is a magnetic field, generated deep in the molten heart of our planet, reaching far out into space and wrapping the entire Earth in an invisible cocoon. The second is the atmosphere, the ocean of air above your head, which is far thicker and heavier than it feels. Together, these 2 shields absorb and deflect a constant, ceaseless rain of radiation coming from the sun and from the wider galaxy. You're standing at the bottom of that protection right now, and you cannot feel it working, in the same way a fish cannot feel the weight of the water it has always lived in. The moment a spacecraft carries human beings beyond that shelter, the water is gone, and the rain begins to fall on them directly. There are 2 kinds of this radiation, and it is worth understanding both, because they threaten the body in different ways. The first comes from the sun. Our star is not the calm, steady lamp it appears to be. It is a churning, violent thing that constantly throws off a stream of charged particles, and every so often it erupts, hurling out a sudden storm of high-energy particles in a single burst. These solar storms are dangerous, but there is a mercy to them. They can, for the most part, be shielded against. A thick enough wall, a well-placed storm shelter in the middle of the ship, surrounded by supplies and water, can absorb the worst of a solar outburst and keep the crew alive through it. If the sun were the only threat, the problem would be difficult, but solvable. The second kind is the one that keeps the scientists awake. It is called galactic cosmic radiation, and it does not come from our sun at all. It comes from the far reaches of the galaxy, from ancient catastrophic events like the explosions of dying stars, events that may have happened millions of years ago and half a galaxy away. These are not gentle particles. They are the bare nuclei of atoms, stripped of everything else, some of them as heavy as the nucleus of iron, accelerated to very nearly the speed of light. A single one of these particles carries so much energy and moves so fast that it can pass straight through the metal wall of a spacecraft, straight through a human body and out the other side, ionizing and damaging everything it touches along the way, like a microscopic bullet fired through tissue. And unlike the solar storms, these cannot really be shielded against with any reasonable amount of mass. You would need to wrap the ship in a wall so thick and so heavy that no rocket could ever lift it. In fact, adding thin or moderate shielding can make things worse, because when these ultra-fast particles smash into the shielding, they shatter it into a spray of secondary radiation so that a poorly shielded wall becomes its own small source of the very thing you are trying to block. Take a moment to really feel how strange it is that we live our entire lives at the bottom of this protection without ever sensing it. Every second of every day, particles from the sun and from deep space are streaming toward you, and every second the magnetic field far above your head is bending them away, and the thick air is absorbing what gets through, so that only the faintest trace ever reaches the ground where you stand. You have never felt this happening. You have never had a reason to. It is one of the countless quiet gifts of Earth that we take so completely for granted that we do not even know they are gifts. We think of the sky as empty, as nothing, as the absence of things. But the sky is not nothing. It is a shield miles deep, and the magnetic field beyond it is a second shield larger than the planet, and together they are the only reason the surface of Earth is gentle enough for soft, unshielded creatures like us to have ever come into being at all. The traveller who leaves does not just leave the ground. They leave the shield, and they will never again, for the rest of the mission, stand beneath anything like it. Now let us put numbers on it, because the numbers are what turn this from an abstract worry into a genuine ticking problem. We know the real values, because a NASA rover named Curiosity carried a radiation detector all the way to Mars, measuring the dose along the journey and on the surface. During the deep space crossing, outside Earth's protective field, the rover measured a dose rate of roughly 1.8 millisieverts per day. If that unit means nothing to you, here is the comparison that gives it weight. On the surface of Earth, protected by our shields, a person absorbs somewhere around 3 millisieverts in an entire year from natural background sources. Out in the crossing to Mars, a traveller absorbs a comparable amount roughly every couple of days. To put it another way, the radiation exposure of the journey is a little like receiving a full-body medical scan every 5 or 6 days, for month after month after month, with no way to step out of the machine. Over the whole mission, the outbound journey, the long stay on the surface, and the return journey if it is even attempted, the total dose climbs to something on the order of 1 sievert. 1,000 millisieverts. Some estimates push it higher, toward 1,200. And here is where it becomes personal, because space agencies set career limits on how much radiation a single astronaut is ever allowed to absorb across their entire working life, precisely because the risks of cancer and other damage climb with the dose. Those lifetime limits sit in the same range as the dose from a single round trip to Mars. Read that again slowly. One journey to Mars can deliver, all by itself, close to the total amount of radiation a career astronaut is permitted to receive in a lifetime. A person could make the trip once. After that, by the ordinary rules meant to keep them safe, their career in space would be over, because their body would already carry a lifetime share of damage. What does that damage actually do deep down? Radiation harms us by breaking things at the scale of molecules. It slices through strands of DNA, the instruction manual coiled inside every one of your cells. Most of the time your body can repair these breaks. It is very good at it. But when the breaks come often enough and are severe enough, some of them are repaired wrongly, and a cell with corrupted instructions can become the seed of a cancer years or decades later. Radiation also appears to damage the fine architecture of the brain and the cells of the heart and blood vessels, quietly raising the odds of trouble far down the line. None of this is dramatic in the moment. A traveller crossing to Mars would feel nothing at all. There is no wind, no heat, no sensation. The tide passes through them in perfect silence, and the only record of it is written in the slow accumulation of tiny scars inside their cells. It is worth slowing down on the difference between the two kinds of radiation, because it shapes everything about how a mission would have to be flown. The solar storms, violent as they are, arrive with at least a little warning. Our star is watched constantly by a small fleet of spacecraft, and when the sun hurls out one of its great eruptions, that warning can race ahead at the speed of light, while the slower storm of particles takes hours to arrive. In those hours, a crew could do the one thing that helps. They could retreat into a shelter buried in the heart of the ship, a small space walled off by everything dense they brought with them. The water tanks, the food, the supplies, the waste, all of it stacked around a central refuge to soak up the incoming storm. It is a strange image, a crew huddled in the middle of their own vessel, behind a wall of drinking water and cargo, waiting out an invisible squall from the sun. But it works more or less for the solar storms. It is a problem with a shape, and a shape can be planned for. The galactic radiation has no shape and no warning. It does not come in storms. It comes constantly, evenly, from every direction at once, a steady sleet of heavy particles that never pauses and cannot be hidden from. There is no shelter to duck into, because the particles pass through the shelter as easily as through everything else. This is the exposure that simply accumulates, hour after hour, for the entire crossing and the entire stay, a background dose that no clever engineering can switch off. And these heavy particles are especially cruel to the most delicate tissues we have. When one of them tears through the brain, it can damage the fine wiring of the nervous system in ways that studies suggest may dull thinking, slow reactions, and cloud memory over time. The organ we would most need sharp, the mind of a person who must solve every emergency alone, is among the organs the radiation quietly wears down. There is a grim irony worth naming here. On Earth, we treat radiation of this intensity as a serious industrial hazard, something we shield workers from with thick walls and strict limits and careful monitoring, because we understand how it raises the long-term risk of cancer and damages the body in ways that may not show up for years. We would never knowingly expose a worker to a full career's worth of it in a matter of months, and yet that is precisely what the crossing to Mars asks of the people who make it, not through negligence, but because there is simply no known way to prevent it with any spacecraft light enough to fly. The radiation is not a flaw in the plan that better engineering will soon fix. As far as we currently know, it is a fixed cost of leaving Earth's shelter, paid in the slow currency of damaged cells. And this is the part I find genuinely difficult to hold in my mind. By the time the crew arrives at Mars, before they have taken a single step on its surface, before the real adventure has even begun in the story we like to tell, the damage is already done. The most quietly dangerous thing about the entire mission may be the empty space in between, the part we think of as just travel, just waiting, just the boring middle. It is not the boring middle. It is a slow, invisible tide, and everyone who crosses it arrives on the far shore already carrying it inside them. Radiation, though, is only the first of the changes, and it is the one that leaves no sensation. The next one is different. The next one the body performs on itself, actively, deliberately, and it begins to take the traveller apart from the inside in a way that, strangely, feels like nothing at all is wrong. In fact, it can feel wonderful. That is what makes it so unsettling. Let me show you what I mean. Your body is a lifelong argument with gravity. You may never have thought of it that way, but it is true, and it is happening right now as you rest. Every bone in your skeleton, every muscle in your legs and your back, the very thickness and strength of them, exists because gravity is constantly pulling you down, and your body is constantly building itself up to resist that pull. This is not a background detail of being alive. It is one of the fundamental organizing forces of your entire physical existence. Your skeleton is as strong as it is because every single day it is asked to hold you up against the weight of the world. Take that question away, and the body, being efficient and practical, stops bothering to answer it. This is exactly what happens in the weightlessness of the crossing to Mars. There is no up and no down. Nothing pulls the traveller toward a floor because there is no floor in any meaningful sense. They float, and their body, sensing that the bones and muscles are no longer being asked to fight gravity, begins to quietly dismantle them. It is not damage in the way a wound is damage. It is something almost worse, because it is the body doing it to itself, on purpose, following rules that served it perfectly on Earth and betray it completely in space. The body reads the weightlessness as a message. The message says, you no longer need to be this strong, and so it begins to let go. The numbers here are genuinely startling. In weightlessness, astronauts lose bone at a rate of roughly 1 to 2% every month, and in some cases as much as 3%. Let that rate sink in by extending it forward. After 6 months in space, a traveller could lose something like 10% or more of the mineral density in their weight-bearing bones, the hips, the spine, the long bones of the legs. Over the full length of a Mars mission, which stretches across years, the cumulative loss could climb toward a range we normally associate with the frailest of the elderly. Consider this comparison, which I find almost hard to believe even as I say it. A woman of 70 with severe osteoporosis, a disease we think of as the fragility of old age, may have lost 30 to 40% of her bone mass over decades. A Mars astronaut in the prime of life in their 30s could approach that same territory in a matter of a couple of years. They could arrive at Mars or return toward Earth, carrying the skeleton of someone half a century older. The mechanism underneath this is a kind of tragic misunderstanding inside the body. Bone is not the dead, static thing we imagine. It is a living tissue, constantly being torn down and rebuilt by two opposing crews of cells, one that dissolves old bone and one that lays down new bone. On Earth, these two crews stay in balance because the daily stress of gravity signals the building crew to keep working. Remove the gravity, and the signal to build fades, but the crew that dissolves bone keeps right on going. The result is a slow, steady net loss, and all that dissolved bone has to go somewhere. The calcium that made it strong is released into the bloodstream and carried away, much of it filtered out through the kidneys, where it can gather and harden into kidney stones. So the very act of losing the skeleton creates a second painful danger along the way. The body is not just weakening, it is shedding its own foundation into its bloodstream. The muscles follow the same path and they follow it just as fast. Without the constant work of holding the body upright and moving it against gravity, the muscles atrophy at a rate similar to the bones, roughly 1 to 3% of their mass per month. And again, it is the postural muscles that suffer most. The muscles of the legs, the back, the core, precisely the muscles a person needs to stand, to walk, to hold their own head up under real weight. Deep inside the muscle, the very fibers change character, shifting from the slow, patient, endurance-oriented type toward a faster type that tires quickly and is not built for the long, steady work of living under gravity. The astronauts on the space station fight this with a brutal exercise regime, strapping themselves to machines and working out for around 2 hours every single day. And even with all of that effort, they only slow the loss. They do not stop it. The body is determined to forget Earth, and the most you can do is argue with it. What makes this so different from an ordinary injury is that the body is not being harmed by some outside force. It is doing this to itself, on purpose, following instructions that are perfectly wise on Earth. Your body is constantly, sensibly economical. It does not waste energy maintaining strength it is not using. On the ground, this thrift is a gift, because the daily pull of gravity keeps demanding that strength, so the body keeps supplying it, and the two stay in balance. In space, the same thrift becomes a slow catastrophe, because the demand vanishes while the thrift continues, and the body cheerfully dismantles the very structures that would let it ever return to the world it came from. There is no villain in this story, no malfunction. The body is working exactly as designed. It is simply that the design assumed something that is no longer true, the one assumption written into every cell of every creature Earth has ever produced, the assumption that there will always be weight. Take away the weight, and the wisdom of the body quietly turns into the unmaking of it. Let me take you inside this for a moment, because the numbers do not capture the strangest part of it. Imagine you are the traveller. You are 4 months into the crossing. You are floating in the soft, humming quiet of the ship, and the truth is, you feel wonderful. You feel light. You feel free. Every motion is effortless. You push off a wall with one finger and drift across the cabin like something in a dream. There is no ache in your knees, no weight on your spine, no fatigue in your legs, because your legs are not carrying anything at all. You have never in your life felt so unburdened, and that, precisely that, is the horror of it. Because at this exact moment, in this exact feeling of blissful lightness, your bones are quietly surrendering their calcium into your blood. Your heart is beginning to shrink. Your muscles are thinning. Nothing hurts. Nothing warns you. The body sends up no alarm because from its own point of view, everything is fine, everything is efficient, everything is adapting beautifully to a world without weight. The comfort is not the absence of the damage. The comfort is the damage. You are dissolving and it feels like peace. That is the thing about this stage of the journey that I cannot stop turning over in my mind. We are used to danger announcing itself. Pain is a signal. Heat, cold, injury, exhaustion, these things shout at us so that we protect ourselves. But the unmaking of the body in space is silent and painless and even pleasant, which means the traveller's own senses cannot be trusted to tell them what is happening. They must rely entirely on measurements, on scans, on cold data, to know that the very structure holding them together is being taken apart. Their body has become an unreliable narrator of its own condition, and every day of the long crossing, the story it tells them is a comfortable lie. There is a second danger hidden inside the loss of bone, and it is one that turns the slow dissolving into something sharp and immediate. All that calcium leaving the skeleton does not simply vanish. It travels in the blood to the kidneys, which filter it out, and when there is too much of it passing through, it can crystallize and harden into stones. A kidney stone is one of the more excruciating things a human body can produce, and on Earth it usually means a trip to a hospital. Now imagine one forming inside a traveller halfway to Mars, months from any hospital, with no surgeon within 100 million kilometres, in a body already weakened by the journey. A problem that is merely painful on Earth becomes a genuine crisis in deep space, and it grows directly out of the same quiet process that is thinning the bones. The body, in shedding its own foundation, seeds a second emergency in the very act of the first, and the recovery, even in the best case, is not guaranteed. We have watched astronauts return from long stays in orbit and slowly, painfully rebuild their bones and muscles back toward what they were over months of careful work under full gravity. But not always all the way. Some astronauts never fully regain the bone density they lost. Their skeletons carry the trip with them for the rest of their lives, a permanent discount taken from their strength. And that is after missions measured in months, followed by a return to the full gravity of home, which is itself the strongest medicine, the very force that tells the body to rebuild. A Mars traveller would have neither the short duration nor the full gravity recovery. They would have years of loss, followed at best by the weak partial gravity of Mars, which may not be enough to trigger any real rebuilding at all. The body's own repair process depends on the one thing they would not have. It depends on weight. By the time the crew nears Mars, they are no longer quite the same creatures who left Earth. Their skeletons are lighter, their muscles are weaker, their hearts, as we're about to see, have changed shape. They have spent months being gently disassembled by their own biology, and the disassembly does not reverse just because the destination is near. This matters enormously, for a reason we will return to again and again tonight. A body that has forgotten Earth cannot simply remember it on command. The strength that took a lifetime under gravity to build does not come back in a day, or a week, or perhaps ever fully. And Mars, the place they are falling toward, does not have enough gravity to remind the body what it lost. But before we set foot on that cold ground, there is one more organ we need to talk about, because it is the one that changes in the most quietly astonishing way of all. It is the one muscle you cannot exercise your way out of losing, and it is the one you least want to fail. It is the heart. Of all the changes the journey works on the human body, the one that happens to the heart may be the most poetic and the most frightening at the same time. We are taught to think of the heart as the strong centre of us, the tireless engine, the one part that simply keeps going no matter what, and it is tireless. But it is also, at the end of the day, a muscle, and every muscle in the body obeys the same ruthless law we just watched play out in the bones and the legs. Use it, and it stays strong. Stop using it, and it fades. The heart is not exempt from this law. In space, the heart discovers that it has far less work to do, and so, like every other muscle, it begins to shrink. To understand why, you have to think about what the heart actually does against gravity. On Earth standing up, your heart has to pump blood upward against the constant downward pull all the way to your brain. That is genuinely hard work. A great deal of the heart's strength exists precisely to lift blood against gravity, to keep your head supplied while you're upright. Now take gravity away. In weightlessness, there is no up for the blood to be lifted against. The blood no longer pulls in the legs and has to be hauled back up. It simply floats evenly throughout the body. And the heart, suddenly relieved of the hardest part of its job, does what any muscle does when the load is removed. It relaxes. It downsizes. Studies of astronauts who have spent long stretches in orbit have measured the heart actually losing mass, shrinking by something in the range of 20% or more. The strong centre of us grows smaller and softer, quietly, over the months, because we have taken away the weight it was built to lift. At the same time, something strange and visible happens to the blood itself, or rather to where it goes. On Earth, gravity is always gently pulling your bodily fluids downward, which is why your legs are a normal size and your face is a normal size. In space, that downward pull is gone and the fluids redistribute. Blood and other fluids drift upward, toward the head and chest, and stay there. The result is the classic look of the long-duration astronaut, a puffy, swollen face and strangely thin, spindly legs. The travellers to Mars would look, after a while, subtly wrong to our eyes, their faces fuller, their legs like reeds, all because the ordinary downward settling of fluid that shapes a human body on Earth has simply stopped. And the body responds to this fluid shift in a way that makes the whole situation worse for any future return. When all that fluid rushes to the upper body, the body's sensors, many of which live in the chest and neck, get the impression that there is too much fluid in the system. So the body does the logical thing, it sheds what it thinks is the excess. It reduces the total volume of blood, sometimes by 10 to 20%. The traveller ends up with a smaller heart pumping a smaller volume of blood, perfectly adapted to a world with no gravity, and perfectly unsuited to a world with any. Every part of the cardiovascular system reconfigures itself for weightlessness, as if the body has quietly decided that this floating existence is the new permanent condition, and it may as well stop wasting resources preparing for a gravity that never comes. You can already see the shape of the problem this creates, but let us name it clearly. Imagine what happens when this shrunken heart, pumping this reduced volume of blood, is suddenly asked to work against full gravity again. On Earth, standing up requires the heart to push blood up to the brain against the very pull it has spent months forgetting how to fight. A heart that has lost a fifth of its strength, moving less blood than before, may simply not be able to do it, This is not a hypothetical. Astronauts returning from just 6 months on the space station, back to the Earth they left, often cannot stand up without becoming dizzy, without their blood pressure collapsing, without fainting. Their bodies have to be carried, and they need weeks of careful rehabilitation to teach the heart and the blood vessels to fight gravity again. And that is after 6 months, returning to the familiar, welcoming, one-gravity world of home where help is everywhere. Now stretch that to the scale of a Mars mission, not 6 months, but years. And here is the cruel twist that we'll keep circling back to. The traveller does not get to return to a gentle, full-gravity Earth to recover under the care of doctors. At the end of the outbound journey, the deconditioned heart, the shrunken muscle pumping its reduced blood, arrives instead at Mars, where the gravity is only a fraction of Earth's. That weak gravity is not enough to challenge the heart back into strength, but it is a change nonetheless, and the body must cope with it while already diminished. And then, if a return to Earth is ever attempted, the same weakened heart that could barely handle Mars would have to survive the crushing return to full Earth gravity after years away, not the 6 months that already leaves station astronauts unable to walk. The math does not look kind. Picture what that return would actually feel like, in the body, if it were ever attempted. For years the settler has lived light, first in the weightlessness of the crossing, then in the gentle third gravity of Mars. Their blood has settled into that easy rhythm, their heart has grown small and content, and then, at the end of the long journey home, Earth reaches up and takes hold of them with a force they have not felt in years. Suddenly their blood, which had floated so evenly, is dragged downward, away from the brain, pooling in the legs. The shrunken heart strains to haul it back up and cannot quite manage. The world tilts and greys at the edges. Simply sitting upright becomes an effort. Standing becomes nearly impossible without collapse. This is the ordinary experience of astronauts returning after mere months, met at their landing by teams who lift them from the capsule and carry them because they cannot carry themselves. Now imagine it after years, in a body far more deconditioned, and you begin to see why the return is not simply a matter of getting the rocket to work. Even a perfect landing delivers a person whose own weight has become an adversary. The cruelest part is that Mars, the place that might have begun to heal them, cannot. The one medicine that rebuilds a body after weightlessness is gravity itself, the honestful pull that forces the bones and the heart to work and grow strong again. Mars offers only a third of that dose, too weak to trigger real rebuilding, strong enough only to remind the body of a burden it can no longer fully bear. So the settler does not recover on Mars and then face Earth strong. They arrive on Mars already weakened, they stay weakened or grow weaker across the years, and if they ever turn toward home, they turn toward it from a greater deficit than any returning astronaut has ever faced, toward the one force in the universe most likely to finish what the journey started. Home, the very thing they long for, becomes the thing their body is least able to survive. There is something almost tender in what the heart does out there, if you let yourself see it that way. The heart is not failing, it is adapting. It is doing exactly what it evolved to do, responding faithfully to its environment, becoming precisely the heart that a weightless life requires. It is leaving Earth behind as sincerely as the rest of the body, reshaping itself for a place it has never been. The tragedy is only that we did not evolve for this. Every instinct the body has, every rule it follows, was written by a few billion years of life under one steady gravity, and out there, in the between places and on the thin, cold world at the end of the trip, those rules quietly turn against the very person they were meant to protect. The heart shrinks in good faith, and a heart that shrinks in good faith is still a heart that may not be strong enough to bring its owner home. And it is not only the heart that reshapes itself in the strangest ways. The same upward drift of fluid that puffs the face and thins the legs also pushes on the eyes and on the brain. Many astronauts who spend long stretches in orbit come home with their vision changed, sometimes permanently. The back of the eyeball can flatten, the nerve behind it can swell, and the fine focus of sight can shift, all of it apparently connected to the raised pressure of fluid that no longer drains downward as it should. A traveller could arrive at Mars or return from it, literally seeing the world differently than when they left, their eyes reshaped by months without gravity's steady downward pull. The change is so common among long-duration crews that it has been given its own name, and its causes are still not fully understood, which is its own quiet warning about how much we do not yet know. The list goes on, quietly, in the background. The immune system, that careful internal guardian, becomes confused and sluggish in space, and dormant viruses that a healthy body normally keeps silent can flare back to life. When two twin brothers, one an astronaut who spent nearly a year in orbit and one who stayed on Earth, were studied side by side, the differences that emerged were sobering. The twin who went to space showed changes in how his genes were switched on and off, shifts in the protective caps on the ends of his chromosomes that lengthened in space and then shortened again on his return, and measurable declines in aspects of his thinking that lingered after he came home. His twin on the ground, living the same genes in a normal life, showed none of it. That study offered one of the clearest windows we have into what a long stay off Earth actually does to a person, and the view through that window is not reassuring. It says the body registers the absence of Earth at every level, from the shape of the eye down to the reading of the genes themselves. So this is the traveller as they finally approach the red planet, carrying a lifetime's radiation dose absorbed in silence, wearing a skeleton lightened by months of forgetting, moving a smaller volume of blood with a smaller heart, every one of these changes invisible, painless, and pointing the same direction, away from the possibility of an easy return. And all of it, every bit of it, was supposed to be the easy part, the journey, the waiting. Because surely, you might think, arrival is the reward. Surely reaching Mars after all of that is the moment of relief. I wish I could tell you that it is. But arrival, as we are about to see, is not relief at all. Arrival is where the second half of the trap is waiting. There is a moment we all imagine when we picture reaching another world. The descent, the landing, the hatch opening, the first boot pressing into alien ground, the traveller standing at last on the surface of Mars beneath a strange pink sky. In the story we tell, this is the triumph, the payoff, the summit of the whole endeavour. And I want to honour that, because it genuinely would be one of the most extraordinary things our species has ever done. But I also want to gently take the story apart, because underneath the triumph is a truth that the moment of arrival hides. Reaching Mars is not the end of the danger. In many ways, it is the beginning of a new and permanent one. The traveller has not arrived at safety. They have arrived at a second, slower version of the same trap. Start with the ground under their feet, or rather the lack of weight upon them. Mars has gravity, but only about 38% of Earth's. A person who weighs a certain amount on Earth would feel less than 4/10 of that on Mars. In the short term, this sounds pleasant, even magical, a world where you can leap and bound and carry heavy loads with ease. But remember what we have learned. The human body maintains its bones and muscles and heart in direct response to the pull of gravity. On Earth, full gravity keeps us strong. In weightlessness, the absence of gravity dismantles us, and Mars sits in a strange and largely unexplored middle. 38% is not zero, so the dismantling may slow, but it is nowhere near the full pull that built the body in the first place, so there is little reason to believe it is enough to stop the decline, let alone reverse it. The traveller arrives already weakened, and steps out into a gravity too gentle to make them strong again. And here we run straight into one of the most unsettling facts in this entire story, a fact that hides beneath the whole grand plan of sending humans to Mars. We do not actually know what 38% gravity does to a human body over years. We have no data, none. Every measurement we have ever taken of the human body in altered gravity comes from one of two places: the near-zero gravity of orbit, or the full gravity of Earth's surface. The enormous middle ground, the partial gravity that a person would actually live in on the Moon or on Mars, is a complete blank in human medicine. No one has ever lived there long enough to be studied. So the entire enterprise of settling Mars rests on an assumption that has never once been tested, the assumption that a body can endure for years at a fraction of the gravity it was made for. We are, in the most literal sense, planning to find out by sending people. The first Martians would not just be explorers, they would be the experiment. Their bodies would be the data. Now lift your eyes from the ground to the world around them. Mars is beautiful, in the way that deserts and frozen places are beautiful, but it is savagely hostile to human life in nearly every measurable way. The air, first of all, is not air. It is more than 95% carbon dioxide, unbreathable, and there is almost none of it. The atmospheric pressure at the surface is less than 1% of what you are breathing right now. This is not merely thin air that would leave you gasping. It is so thin that it sits below a critical threshold, the point at which water boils at the temperature of the human body. Step outside without a sealed suit, and the moisture on your eyes and tongue and in your lungs would begin to boil away even as you froze. There is no holding your breath and running to shelter. The surface of Mars is as lethally exposed as the vacuum of space, only coloured red and scattered with rock so that it looks, deceptively, like somewhere you could stand. And it is not as though the danger politely takes turns. On Earth, hazards tend to come one at a time, and between them there is ordinary, breathable, survivable life. On the surface of Mars, the hazards are simply the permanent condition. The airlessness is always there. The cold is always there. The radiation is always falling. The low gravity is always at work. There is no moment ever when a person on the surface is not being threatened by all of these at once. No safe interval, no ordinary hour. To step outside is to place a thin layer of engineering between yourself and several different ways of dying simultaneously, and to trust that layer completely, every second, with no break. That constant total exposure is something no environment on Earth demands of us. Not the deepest ocean, not the highest mountain, not the coldest pole. Even our planet's harshest places give the body air to breathe and pressure to hold it together. Mars gives nothing, and it gives that nothing relentlessly. Then there is the cold. The average temperature across Mars is around minus 63 degrees Celsius, far colder than the coldest inhabited places on Earth. On a good day near the equator, at the warmest hour, the ground might climb to something mild, but the thin air holds no heat, so the warmth never spreads. There is so little atmosphere to trap and move heat that on that same warm afternoon, the temperature at your feet and the temperature at your head, just a metre or two higher, can differ by an astonishing amount, your boots in relative warmth while your face sits near freezing. And when the sun goes down, the heat vanishes almost instantly into the black sky, and the temperature plunges toward minus 100 and beyond. Every night on Mars is colder than almost anything the human body has ever survived unprotected. The air deserves a longer look, because its absence shapes every single hour a person would spend on Mars. It is not merely that the air is unbreathable, being almost entirely carbon dioxide. It is that there is so vanishingly little of it. The blanket of gas over Mars is so thin that it provides almost no protection and almost no warmth, and it presses on the surface with less than 1/100th of the force our own air presses on us. To a human body, standing on Mars without a sealed suit would not feel like standing on a high mountain gasping in thin air. It would be far more violent than that. At that pressure, the liquids in your body would begin to turn to vapour at your own body temperature, the moisture on your eyes and in your lungs boiling away even as the cold bit into you. Every moment outside would be spent inside a suit that is, in effect, a personal spacecraft, holding a bubble of breathable pressure around a single fragile body, one puncture away from disaster. There is no stepping out for fresh air on Mars because there is no air, and what passes for air would kill you in ways that are hard to even picture. To breathe at all, the settlers would have to manufacture their own oxygen, pulling it out of that carbon dioxide atmosphere or out of buried ice through machines that split the molecules apart, and then recycle every breath endlessly, scrubbing out the carbon dioxide they exhale so it can be used again. We have taken only the very first baby step toward this. A small device carried on a recent rover managed to make a faint whisper of oxygen out of the Martian air, roughly enough to keep a small animal breathing, and no more. To keep a crew of humans breathing, and to do it reliably for years, with machines that never fail in the cold and the dust, is a vastly larger challenge, one we have barely begun to approach. Every breath those settlers took would be a manufactured thing, produced by machinery that must never stop, on a world whose natural air is trying to freeze and boil them at the same time, and above it all, there is no shield. Remember the two great protectors we take for granted on Earth, the magnetic field and the thick atmosphere. Mars has effectively neither. Its global magnetic field died billions of years ago, and its atmosphere is a whisper. So the same galactic radiation that fell on the crew during the crossing keeps falling on them on the surface, day after day, year after year. Arriving at Mars does not end the invisible tide. It only changes its rhythm. The traveller trades the radiation of open space for the radiation of an unshielded planet, and the difference is smaller than anyone would like. Let us dwell for a moment on that untested middle gravity, because it is one of the quiet scandals hiding inside the entire dream of Mars. We speak with great confidence about people living on the surface, working, building, raising the first families under that pink sky. And yet the single most basic fact about living there, what a lifetime at 38% gravity does to a human being, is a total unknown. We do not know whether a child could develop normally in it, whether bones and hearts grown from birth under that weak pull would form properly or would come out strange and fragile. We do not know whether an adult body would find some new stable balance there, weaker than on Earth but steady, or whether it would simply keep declining slowly for the rest of a life. Every animal that has ever lived, every human who has ever been born, developed under exactly one gravity, the full pull of Earth. Mars offers something no living thing has ever experienced for long, and we are proposing to find out what it does by living it. There is no simulation for this, no shortcut, no way to know in advance. The knowledge can only be bought with human lives spent inside the experiment, and the transitions between gravities may be as dangerous as any single one of them. The traveller goes from the full gravity of Earth to the weightlessness of the crossing to the weak gravity of Mars, and then, if they ever try to return, back through weightlessness to full gravity again. Each of those handoffs is a shock to a body that has spent months or years adapting to the last condition. We already know how brutal just one of those transitions is, the return from orbit to Earth, which leaves strong astronauts unable to stand. A Mars mission stacks several such transitions on top of each other, spread across years, each one landing on a body more worn than the last. It is not one adaptation, it is a whole sequence of them, and the body was never designed to keep changing its mind about which world it belongs to. So let us stand there, on the surface, and feel the full weight of what arrival actually means. You have crossed more than 200 million kilometers of empty, silent space. You have survived the tide of radiation that soaked through you the whole way. Your bones are lighter, your muscles thinner, your heart smaller than when you left. You have endured all of it, holding on to the idea that the surface of Mars was the goal, the reward, the safe harbour at the end of the impossible voyage, and now you are here, and Mars, patiently, quietly, is also killing you. The cold is trying to kill you. The airlessness is trying to kill you. The radiation is still falling. The gravity is too weak to heal you. There was never a safe shore waiting at the end of this crossing. There was only a slower current. You did not escape the thing that was working on your body in space. You simply walked out onto the ground where it continues, under a pink sky, 200 million kilometers from anyone who could help. That is the realization that I think would strike the first Martians hardest, somewhere in the first days of standing on that ground. Not fear exactly, something quieter and heavier than fear. The understanding that arrival was never going to save them, because there was nothing on this world built to save them. They have reached the destination, and the destination is not a rescue. It is the second half of the trap, closing gently around them beneath the most beautiful and terrible sky any human being has ever stood under. And with that understanding settling in, it becomes worth stopping, just for a moment, to gather everything we have seen so far and to look honestly at the shape it is beginning to make. Let us step back for a moment, because we have gathered a great deal, and it helps to lay the pieces side by side before we go deeper. Sometimes, an idea only reveals its true weight when you stop adding to it and simply look at what you already have. So let us do that, slowly, the way you might lay photographs out on a table late at night and finally see the pattern running through all of them. We began with a person in a seat, looking out a window at the world that made them, understanding they were seeing it for the last time. We watched the door lock behind them, not through anyone's decision but through the plain geometry of two planets circling the sun, a door that only opens every 26 months, a crossing too long to reverse, a distance that stretches every cry for help into half an hour of silence. That was the outer wall of the trap built from orbital mechanics and the speed of light. Then we went inward, into the body itself, and we found the trap had an inner wall too, and this one was built by biology. We found the silent tide of radiation soaking through the traveller for months, writing damage into their cells that they could not feel and could not undo, a lifetime's dose absorbed before they ever arrived. We found the skeleton quietly dissolving in weightlessness, a person in their 30s trending toward the bones of someone twice their age. We found the muscles thinning, the postural strength fading, and we found the heart itself shrinking, the blood volume dropping, the whole cardiovascular system faithfully reshaping itself for a world with no gravity, and in doing so quietly disqualifying itself from ever returning to a world that has it. And then we watched the traveller arrive carrying all of this at a place that offered no relief, a world with gravity too weak to rebuild them, air too thin to breathe and thin enough to boil their blood, cold beyond almost anything Earth can offer, and no magnetic shield to stop the radiation from continuing to fall. Arrival was not the reward, it was the second half of the same slow current. Notice something about the way these pieces fit together, because it is the key to the whole thing. None of them, on its own, is necessarily a death sentence. Radiation alone might be survivable with enough shielding and enough luck. Bone loss alone might be managed with drugs and exercise. A hostile surface alone might be endured inside a good enough habitat. If any single one of these problems existed by itself, we could probably, with enough effort, find our way around it. That is what makes the honest picture so heavy. The problems do not exist by themselves. They all arrive at once, on the same body, on the same mission, each one compounding the others. The radiation weakens the body that must also fight the bone loss, that must also endure the low gravity, that must also survive the cold world, that must also, somehow, produce its own air and fuel. It is not one wall to climb. It is many walls, all at the same time, each making the others harder to scale. And a person, unlike a problem on a whiteboard, only has one body to spend on all of it at once. Now here is where the pieces, laid side by side, begin to form a single picture, and the picture is this. Everything about the journey out degrades the body toward a state from which return grows harder, and everything about the destination refuses to heal that state, and instead adds new harms of its own. The two halves are not separate problems. They are two jaws of the same trap, and they close from opposite directions at the same time. The trip out makes the body unfit to come back. The world at the end makes it impossible to fully stay in health. The traveller is caught precisely in the middle, between a return that their biology increasingly forbids and a home that the planet refuses to allow. And we have not even reached the hardest part yet. Because so far we have talked about what happens to the body on the way and what waits for it on arrival. We have not yet talked about the thing everyone quietly wonders about but the brochures never dwell on. Getting back. The actual physical problem of leaving Mars and returning to Earth. Because if the door locked from the outside through distance and locked from the inside through the body, there is a third lock we have not yet examined, and it may be the heaviest of all. It is the sheer, brutal difficulty of climbing back up off the surface of another planet. Let us look at the mountain that no one on Mars can climb back down. We have spent a lot of time on the human body, because the body is where this story is most intimate and most surprising. But there is a colder, more mechanical problem sitting underneath everything, and it is time to face it directly. Even if we set the biology aside for a moment, even if we imagined a crew that had somehow stayed perfectly strong, there remains the simple, brutal engineering challenge of getting off of Mars at all. We talk so easily about going to Mars that we forget going is only half of a round trip, and the second half, the coming home, is by far the harder half. In fact, it may be the single hardest thing about the entire endeavour, and it is the piece that turns a difficult mission into what is very likely a one-way one. Think about what it took to leave Earth in the first place. An enormous rocket taller than a building, almost entirely full of fuel, burning that fuel in a controlled fury to tear a small capsule of people up and away from the grip of our planet's gravity. That entire towering machine existed to lift a tiny payload off the ground. Now consider what it would take to do the same thing again, but on Mars. To return home, the crew cannot simply step back into the ship that carried them and press a button. They need a whole second rocket, a Mars ascent vehicle, powerful enough to lift them off the surface of Mars and back up into space, where they could begin the long journey home. And here is the thing that should give everyone pause. No such vehicle has ever been built. No rocket has ever launched human beings up off the surface of another planet. It has never once been done, anywhere, by anyone. It exists only on paper and in hope. The difficulty is not just building the rocket, it is getting the rocket, and its fuel, to Mars in the first place. Fuel is heavy, extraordinarily heavy, and the more fuel you need to launch home, the more fuel you needed to carry it all the way to Mars, which means an even bigger rocket leaving Earth, which needs even more fuel, and the whole thing spirals into impossibility very quickly. The numbers fight you at every step. Mars' gravity, while weaker than Earth's, is still substantial, and escaping it requires reaching a speed of about 5 kilometers every second. That is a tremendous amount of energy to summon on the surface of a world where you brought everything with you. So the plans that take return seriously almost all rely on a single audacious idea. If you cannot carry the return fuel with you, you must make it once you get there. You must manufacture rocket propellant out of the raw materials of Mars itself, pulling carbon dioxide out of the thin Martian air and water out of the buried ice, and combining them through chemistry into methane and oxygen that a rocket can burn. This idea is elegant, and it may even be essential, but let us be honest about where it stands. It has been demonstrated only at the tiniest scale. A small instrument aboard one of the recent rovers, called MOXIE, successfully produced oxygen from the Martian atmosphere for the first time in the year 2021. It was a genuine milestone, the first time human machinery ever manufactured a usable resource on another world. But it produced only a few grams of oxygen per hour, roughly enough to keep a small animal breathing. To fuel a rocket capable of lifting human beings off Mars, you would need to run a chemical plant, autonomously, reliably, for months or years, in the cold and the dust with no one able to repair it in real time. We have made a thimble of oxygen. We're talking about needing an ocean of fuel. And now, having laid out the machine, let us bring the body back into the room, because this is where the two problems fuse into something worse than either alone. Suppose, against all these odds, the return vehicle is there, fueled and waiting. Suppose it works. The crew who would climb into it are not the crew who left Earth. They are people who have now spent years in low gravity, on top of the months of weightlessness getting there. Their bones are thinned, their muscles are weakened, their hearts are smaller, and the act of launching off Mars and later re-entering and landing on Earth is one of the most physically violent things a human body can experience, a crushing press of acceleration and deceleration that even strong, healthy, fully conditioned astronauts describe as brutal. We already know that astronauts returning from 6 months in orbit often cannot stand without fainting, cannot walk without help, need weeks to recover in the gentle, supportive full gravity of home. Now ask that same failing body, after years away rather than months, to survive the violence of launch, the long journey back, and then the crushing return to the full gravity of Earth, a gravity it has not felt in years and has actively forgotten how to fight. This is the moment where the phrase we have been carrying reveals its true face. No back on the way home. When I first said it, back at the beginning, it sounded like a description of the trip, a note about trajectories and fuel. But look at it now. There may be no back on the way home not merely because the rocket is hard to build, but because the body that would ride it may not survive the ride. The return is blocked twice over, once by the machine that does not yet exist, and once by the flesh that can no longer take the strain. Even a perfect rocket cannot carry home a heart too weak to beat against Earth's pull. The mountain is not only made of metal and fuel, it is also made of bone and muscle. And the person standing at the bottom of it, looking up, is precisely the person least able to climb it, because the very journey that brought them here is what took their strength away. There is a timing problem folded into all of this that makes it even harder, and it echoes the locked door we met at the very beginning. Just as the crew could only leave Earth when the planets aligned, they could only leave Mars when the planets align again, which means a return is not something that can happen whenever the crew decides they have had enough. They would have to survive on the surface for something like a year and a half, waiting for the launch window home to open, before a return could even be attempted. So the fuel plant would need to run reliably for all those months, in the cold and the dust, manufacturing propellant the entire time, with the crew's only route home depending on a machine that has never been tested at that scale on another world. If it falters, if the dust clogs it, if a part fails and cannot be replaced, there is no backup launch and no rescue. The window closes, and the next one is more than 2 years away. The return does not just require a miracle of engineering. It requires that miracle to keep working untended for a very long time. It helps to compare this with the one time we did bring people back from another world. When human beings went to the moon and returned, it was rightly celebrated as one of the greatest feats in our history, and it was. But the moon is close, only a few days away, close enough that the crew carried all their return fuel with them the whole time, close enough that if something went wrong, home was always just there, hanging huge in the black sky. The return from the moon was hard, but it was a known, carried, self-contained thing. A return from Mars is a different order of problem entirely. It is too far to carry the fuel, so the fuel must be made on arrival. It is too far to bring quickly, so the crew must survive for years before they can even begin. It is too far for rescue, so every step must work the first time. The moon let us dip a toe across the threshold and pull it back. Mars does not offer that. Mars is far enough that crossing the threshold for the first travellers very likely means staying on the far side of it. The difference is not one of degree, it is the difference between a visit and a departure. And consider the sheer cascade of dependencies that a safe return demands, each one of which must succeed. The return vehicle must survive the journey to Mars and land intact. The fuel plant must arrive, deploy, and run for months without failure. The crew must stay healthy enough to operate it and to endure the launch. The ascent vehicle must lift off flawlessly from a surface where no rocket has ever launched. The crew must survive months more in weightlessness on the way back. And then their worn, thinned, deconditioned bodies must survive the crushing return to full Earth gravity. Every one of those steps is difficult. Several of them have never been done at all, and they must all succeed in sequence, with no room for a single failure, for a single person to make it home. When you lay the chain out link by link, the honest conclusion is not that return is impossible in principle. It is that the odds of the whole chain holding for the very first crew are slim enough that planning for a one-way stay is not pessimism, it is realism. So this is the third lock, and it may be the final one. The distance locked the door from the outside, the body locked it from the inside, and now the sheer physics of leaving a planet locks it a third time, with a mountain that grows taller the weaker the climber becomes. 3 locks, on 3 doors, all of them closing on the same handful of people standing on the same cold red ground. And we still have not asked the question that Mars itself poses, separate from the body, separate from the rocket. Even if a person could somehow stay strong, even if they never intended to return, could they actually build a life there? Could Mars, in any real sense, become a home? That question deserves its own answer, and the answer is harder than you might think, because Mars, it turns out, does not want to be a home. Let me show you a world that resists every attempt to belong to it. There is a word that gets used constantly when people talk about the future of Mars, and it is a word worth examining very carefully, because it may be the wrong one. The word is colonize. To colonize a place is to settle it, to make a self-sustaining life there, to put down roots that do not depend on a lifeline stretching back to somewhere else. When people imagine colonizing Mars, they imagine towns, farms, families, a branch of humanity that lives and grows and continues on its own, independent of Earth. It is a stirring vision. But when you look closely at what Mars actually is, at the raw material a settler would have to work with, the vision runs into a wall of reality that is very hard to climb. Mars does not resist us with drama. It resists us with patience, with 1,000 quiet impossibilities, each one small, all of them together overwhelming. Start with the most basic thing a self-sustaining colony would need: food. To grow food, you need soil, and Mars has no soil. This is a distinction people often miss, so let us be precise about it. Earth's soil is not just crushed rock. It is a living thing, built up over countless ages by the bodies of dead plants and animals, threaded through with worms and insects and microbes, rich with the organic material that roots need. What covers Mars is not soil. It is regolith, a fine, dead, pulverized dust and rock, never touched by life, holding none of the organic richness that makes things grow, and worse than merely being lifeless, it is poisoned. The Martian regolith is laced with chemicals called perchlorates, toxic salts that make up something like 0.5% to 1% of the surface material. To a human being, perchlorate is a poison that interferes with the thyroid gland. To a plant, it is a contaminant that the plant would absorb so that even if you coax something to grow, eating it could harm you. A settler who wanted to farm on Mars would first have to wash the poison out of the very ground, batch by batch, before they could even begin. There is a strange cruelty in that perchlorate, and it is worth pausing on, because it captures something about the whole planet. That same toxic salt is not purely an enemy. Handled correctly, perchlorate can be broken down to release oxygen, and it pulls moisture from the air, and it could in principle be turned toward keeping settlers alive. The very substance most likely to poison a colonist is also one that might help sustain them. Mars is full of these double-edged gifts, resources that are also hazards, help that is also harm. Nothing on this world comes clean. Everything useful arrives wrapped around something dangerous, and the settler would spend their days negotiating with a planet that offers nothing simply. Then there is water, and here at least there is genuine hope, but hope with conditions. Mars does have water, a great deal of it, but almost all of it is locked away as ice. There is ice at the poles, great frozen caps of it. There is ice filling the floors of certain craters, and there is ice buried beneath the surface across much of the planet, mapped by spacecraft in orbit as a hidden layer of permafrost. This water is the single most precious resource a colony could have, for drinking, for growing, for making the oxygen and fuel that survival depends on. But it is frozen, often buried, often far from where you might want to live, and extracting it means hard, continuous labour in brutal conditions, every litre earned against the cold. Water is there. It is simply never free and never easy. And beneath the drama of storms and poison and cold, there is the simple, grinding relentlessness of it, which may in the end be the hardest thing of all. Life on Mars would be a life of ceaseless maintenance, because nothing there is forgiving of neglect. On Earth, if a machine breaks, you can open a window, walk outside, wait for a repair. On Mars, every system that keeps you alive is a system that can kill you by failing, and there is no window to open. The dust gets into everything, fine and clinging and faintly abrasive, coating the solar panels, working into the seals and joints, grinding at the machinery, and it must be cleaned away again and again, endlessly, because a coated panel means less power, and a fouled seal means a leak, and a leak means death. The cold works against every material, making things brittle, straining every join between the warm inside and the frozen outside. There would be no days off from this, no season when the planet relents. Survival on Mars would not be a triumph achieved once and then enjoyed. It would be a task performed every single hour of every single day, forever, against a world that is patiently, indifferently trying to undo all of it. That indifference is worth sitting with, because it is so alien to how we live. Earth, for all its dangers, is fundamentally hospitable. The air is free, the water falls from the sky. The temperature most places will not kill you if you simply stand still. We are so cradled by our planet that we forget it is doing anything at all. Mars offers none of that cradling. It gives nothing freely. Every breath, every degree of warmth, every drop of water, every calorie of food would have to be wrung from a world that offers no help and forgives no mistake. To live there is to exist permanently at the very edge of a cliff, kept from falling only by machines and vigilance, knowing that a single long failure, a storm that lasts too long, a part that cannot be fixed, a system that quietly stops, is the end. That is not a home in any sense we know the word. It is a siege that never lifts, and over all of it hangs the sky, and the sky on Mars is not always the calm pink dome of the artwork. Mars has dust storms unlike anything on Earth, and the greatest of them are almost beyond imagining. Every few Martian years, roughly every 5 or 6 of our years, conditions align, and a dust storm grows and grows, until it does not merely cover a region or a continent, but wraps itself around the entire planet, a single storm the size of a world. These global storms can last for weeks, sometimes months, filling the atmosphere with fine dust that blots out the sun and turns day into a dim, choking twilight. And that darkness is not merely unpleasant, it is deadly to a settlement that depends on sunlight for power. One of these great storms, in the year 2018, is what finally killed a NASA rover named Opportunity, choking off the light to its solar panels until it fell silent forever. What kills a hardened robot would be a mortal threat to a colony of human beings, depending on that same light to keep their air warm and their systems running. Let me set you down in the middle of one of these storms, because the numbers do not carry the feeling of it. You are standing on the Martian surface in the late afternoon, and the sky, for once, is clear and rust-coloured and almost peaceful. Then you see it, far off along the horizon, a wall. It is pale and enormous and utterly silent, taller than any storm you have ever seen on Earth, and it is not staying still. It is coming. Over the next hours you watch it climb the sky, swallowing the distant hills, then the nearer ones, then the ground just beyond your habitat, until the wall arrives and the light begins to fail. The sun, already small and cold in the Martian sky, reddens, then dims, then simply goes out, hidden behind a curtain of dust that stretches from the ground to the top of the atmosphere. And now you wait. Not for minutes, not for hours, for weeks, perhaps for months, in a rust-coloured gloom, while the panels that make your power drink in less and less light, while the cold deepens, while every day you check the numbers and hope the storm breaks before your reserves run out. You cannot call for help, you cannot leave. You can only sit inside a thin shell on the surface of a darkened world and endure a storm larger than your entire home planet and hope that this is not the season it decides to last too long. There is nothing on Earth that prepares a person for that kind of patience or that kind of helplessness. Even the simple act of building a shelter on Mars turns out to be a puzzle wrapped in impossibilities. You cannot carry a city with you across 100 million kilometers of space. So the plans imagine building habitats out of Mars itself, scooping up the regolith and, through machines, turning it into something like concrete, printing walls layer by layer with autonomous robots before the humans even arrive. It is an ingenious idea. It is also almost entirely theoretical, depending on robots sophisticated enough to build a home unsupervised on another planet, machines that do not yet exist. And once a shelter is built, it has to be buried, piled over with meters of Martian soil, because that thick blanket of dirt is the only practical shield against the radiation constantly falling from the unprotected sky. The dream of living under a pink sky quietly becomes the reality of living underground, in a buried bunker, venturing out only in a suit, because the surface itself is too exposed to inhabit. Some plans look instead to the natural caves and lava tubes that thread through parts of Mars, ready-made tunnels where settlers could hide from the radiation inside the planet's own stone. Either way, the picture is the same. To live on Mars is to live inside it, sheltered from the world you travelled so far to reach. And then there is the lifeline, the umbilical cord stretching back to Earth, which a true colony is supposed to eventually cut. Everything we have described, the air machines, the fuel plants, the buried habitats, the farms fighting poisoned soil, depends for a long time on a steady stream of supplies, spare parts, and equipment sent from Earth across that enormous gap, arriving only when the launch windows allow, every 2 years or so. A colony that still needs Earth to survive is not self-sustaining. It is a very remote outpost on life support. And closing that gap, becoming genuinely independent, able to make everything you need from the raw materials of Mars with no help from home, is a leap so enormous that it recedes into the far future, decades away at the most optimistic, centuries away by more sober estimates. This is where the dream and the reality part weighs most sharply. There are those who speak of a self-sustaining city of 1 million people within a single lifetime, and there is the quieter voice of the physics and the chemistry, which says that even keeping a handful of people alive would demand a constant lifeline for a very long time to come. It is worth being honest, too, about the fantasy that sits at the far end of all this. The idea that we could simply transform Mars into a second Earth, thicken its air, warm it up, make it green and breathable, and stroll across it one day without a suit. This dream has a name, terraforming, and it runs into a hard wall of arithmetic. Careful study of how much of the gases we would need are actually available and reachable on Mars has concluded that there is simply not enough of them within our grasp, not with any technology we have or can foresee, to warm and thicken the atmosphere into something a human could breathe. And even if there were, the process would take not years but centuries, more likely thousands of years. Mars is not a fixer-upper waiting for a coat of paint. Making it into a place we could live openly is, for all practical purposes and for all foreseeable time, beyond us. The settlers would not inherit a world being gently transformed into Earth. They would inherit Mars exactly as it is, cold and airless and poisoned, and they would have to build every scrap of their survival against it forever. So let us return to that word, colonize, and hold it up against all of this. A poisoned, lifeless ground that has to be washed before it can grow anything. Water that exists only as buried ice, earned by hard labour. Air that cannot be breathed and is thin enough to boil blood. Cold beyond human experience. Radiation with no shield. And storms the size of the planet that can smother the light for months at a time. This is not a frontier waiting for pioneers. This is a world engineered by nothing but chance and physics to resist every attempt to make a home in it. Survival, maybe, with enormous effort and constant supply from Earth is imaginable. But colonization, in the true sense, a Mars that lives on its own, that no longer needs the blue planet behind it, recedes into a distance that all the enthusiasm in the world cannot close. And that leaves the first settlers in a position stranger than exile. They would live in a place they could never truly belong to, on a world that resists their belonging with every gram of its poisoned dust and every hour of its killing cold. Which raises a question we have not yet touched, the one that may weigh heaviest of all. What would that do to the mind of a person who could never come home and could never truly settle where they were? What happens to the human spirit inside the trap? We have talked about the body a great deal tonight, about bones and blood and hearts and the chemistry of poisoned dust. But there is something else that would make the crossing, something harder to measure and perhaps harder to endure than any of it: the mind. Because a human being is not only a body to be kept alive, a human being is a creature of connection, of belonging, of home, and the first people on Mars would be more profoundly cut off from all of that than anyone who has ever lived. The physical trap we have been describing has a psychological shadow, and that shadow may fall heaviest of all. Consider first the sheer confinement of it. Life on Mars would not be lived under open pink skies strolling across the sand. It would be lived inside sealed habitats, inside suits, inside a small number of pressurized rooms shared with the same small number of people, day after day, for years. Every breath of air would be manufactured and recycled. Every window would look out on a landscape that would kill you in minutes if you stepped into it unprotected. There would be no going outside to clear your head. Not really. Not without an hour of preparation and a suit between you and death. There would be no new faces, no crowds, no strangers, no escape from the handful of human beings you travelled with. The walls would always be close. The same voices, the same routines, the same small spaces, stretching on with no relief and no end in sight. There is a word for what the settlers would be cut off from, and it is a bigger word than we usually let it be. Home is not only a place, it is the whole living web a person is stitched into. The familiar streets and the changing seasons, the sound of rain, the smell of the air after it, the faces you know and the faces you pass, the gravity that has held you since before you were born, the particular blue of a sky you stopped noticing decades ago. We are not built to exist apart from all of that. We are, in a real and literal sense, creatures of Earth, shaped in every fibre by this one specific world, tuned to its light and its pull and its rhythms. To leave it is not merely to travel a long way, it is to unplug from the environment that made us and that quietly sustains our minds as surely as it sustains our bodies. No one has ever done that permanently. No human being in all of history has ever been truly, finally severed from the Earth. The first Martians would be the first, and there is no map for what that does to a person, because no one has ever come back to draw one. We actually know a little about what this does to people, because we have created faint echoes of it on Earth. We send scientists to live through the long dark winters of Antarctica, sealed into research stations, cut off by the cold and the distance. We send crews to live for months inside submarines, deep underwater, confined and isolated. And we have learned that these environments take a real toll on the human mind. The people who endure them are carefully screened, carefully supported, monitored for the strain of isolation and confinement, because we know how heavy that strain becomes. But here is the difference, and it is everything. The scientist in Antarctica, the sailor in the submarine, no matter how isolated, no matter how hard the winter, carries with them one quiet, sustaining certainty. They know they can go home. The winter will end. The mission will finish. The submarine will surface. Somewhere ahead of them is a date, a return, the faces of the people they love. That certainty is a lifeline that runs through the darkest stretches, and it is a lifeline the first Martians would not have. Because the settlers on Mars cannot go home. Not soon, and quite possibly not ever, for all the reasons we have spent this whole night uncovering. There is no return date to count down to. There is no winter that ends with a flight back to warmth and family. There is only Mars, and the same walls, and the same faces, and the knowledge that this is not a chapter of life but the whole remainder of it. A person can endure almost anything if they know it will end. It is the endlessness that breaks people, the removal of the horizon, the sense that there is no door at the far side of the hardship. And the first Martians would live inside precisely that endlessness, an isolation with no promised return, a confinement with no release date, held in place not by choice but by physics itself. There is also the slow erosion of monotony, which sounds trivial and is not. The human mind is built for variety, for new faces and new places, for the small daily novelties we barely notice, a change in the weather, a walk down a different street, a stranger's passing smile. Strip all of that away, replace it with the same rooms, the same handful of voices, the same tasks in the same order, day after year, and something in the mind begins to wear thin. The people who study the crews of remote stations and long submarine patrols have a name for the mixture of boredom, irritability, and low, grinding sadness that can set in, and they watch for it carefully. Small annoyances in that pressure can grow into bitter resentments. A crew that must depend on each other absolutely for survival cannot afford to fracture, and yet the very conditions that demand their unity, the confinement, the monotony, the lack of any escape from one another, are precisely the conditions that strain it. There would be nowhere to walk off an argument, nowhere to be alone, nowhere, ever. That was not Mars. And unlike every earlier crew of explorers, they could not even hold on to the thought of the reunion at the end. The polar scientist endures the dark winter partly by imagining the ship that comes in spring, the embrace of family, the ordinary miracle of going home. That imagined future is a kind of food for the spirit. The Martian settler would have no such future to feed on. There would be no spring that ends the winter, no ship coming to carry them back, no reunion to count the days toward. The hardship would not be a passage between two better times. It would simply be the condition of the rest of their life. To endure something with an end in sight is one of the things human beings do best. To endure something with no end at all is one of the things we do worst, and it is precisely what the first Martians would be asked to do. Let me show you the moment I think would carry the most weight of all, the moment where the whole trap distills into a single image. It is early morning on Mars before the crew's work begins, and one of the settlers steps to a window, or stands in a suit just outside the habitat, and looks up into the fading dark of the Martian dawn. And there, among the last stars, is one point of light brighter and steadier than the others, hanging low over the horizon. It is not a star, it is Earth. From the surface of Mars, our entire world is reduced to a single blue point of light, small enough to be hidden behind a raised thumb, a pale dot with no visible features, no continents, no oceans, no clouds. Just a spark of blue in the dark. And the settler stands there and understands, all at once and completely, that every person they have ever loved is standing on that single point of light. Every friend, every parent, every child, every stranger they ever passed on a street, the entire human story except for the few people beside them, all of it, gathered on that one blue spark that they could cover with a fingertip and will never, ever stand on again. The whole trap, the locked door, the failing body, the unbuildable rocket, the resisting world, all of it, folded down into the distance between a person on a cold red hill and a blue point of light in the morning sky. That, I think, is the true shape of the fate we have been circling all night. It is not only physical, it is the specific human agony of seeing home, of being able to point to it, of holding your whole world in the corner of your eye as a fleck of blue, and knowing the distance to it is a distance your own body has made uncrossable. The astronaut in orbit sees the Earth fill the window, huge and near and glowing, and weeps at the beauty of it. The settler on Mars sees it as a dot among the stars, and something colder than beauty passes through them. Longing, maybe, or the quiet arithmetic of never. The strange delay we talked about earlier, the minutes it takes for a signal to cross between the worlds, would work its way into the emotional life of the settlers too. Every message from home would arrive already old. A parent's voice, a child's news, a friend's joke, all of it delivered minutes late, and any reply landing minutes later still, so that no true conversation could ever happen. You could not comfort someone in the moment of their grief, because the moment would be 20 minutes gone before you even heard of it. You could not share a laugh in real time, only trade recordings across the dark. The people you loved would become, in effect, a series of letters and messages from a world you could see but never reach, growing slowly older and further away with every passing year, while you stayed behind on the red planet, watching their lives unfold in delayed fragments. Connection would survive, but only in this thinned, time-lagged form, a love conducted entirely across an unbridgeable gap. And the loneliness would have a generational shape as well, stranger than any exile in history. If children were ever born on Mars, they would be born into the trap without ever having chosen it. They would grow up having never felt Earth's gravity, never breathed its open air, never seen its oceans or its crowds, knowing their ancestral home only as that blue point of light their parents pointed to in the dawn. For them, Earth would be a story, a legend, a place in the sky where the species came from, as distant and unreachable as a myth. And their bodies, grown entirely under the weak Martian pull, might never be capable of visiting it even if a ship could carry them. The trap, in other words, does not close only on the first travellers. It closes on everyone who comes after them, on a whole line of human beings who would live and die having never once stood on the world that made their kind. That is a kind of homesickness for a place you have never been, passed down like an inheritance. And yet, and I want to hold both of these truths at once, human beings are astonishing at enduring the unendurable. People have survived exiles, imprisonments, shipwrecks, winters at the ends of the earth, and found ways to build meaning inside the smallest and harshest of lives. It is not impossible that the first Martians would find something too, a purpose in the work, a closeness with the few beside them, a strange peace in being the first of a new kind of human, belonging to a new kind of place. But we should not pretend that peace would come easily, or that it would come to everyone. The mind in the trap is under a pressure no human mind has ever faced, and the blue point of light in the morning sky is a wound that would not close. That is the psychological fate waiting at the end of the physical one, and it raises the last and strangest question of all. If Mars will not let a normal human body survive, and will not let a normal human mind rest, then what if we change the human being itself? What if the only way to truly live on Mars is to stop being quite so human? That is where this story turns genuinely uncanny, and where we have to go next. Everything we have talked about tonight assumes one thing that we have never questioned. It assumes that the human being going to Mars is an ordinary human being with an ordinary human body evolved for one specific planet. But there is a line of thinking, entirely serious, pursued by real scientists, that looks at all the obstacles we have described and draws a startling conclusion. If the human body cannot survive Mars, then perhaps we should not send the human body as it is. Perhaps we should change it. Perhaps the only way to truly live on another world is to become, deliberately, a different kind of creature. And once you follow that thought, the story stops being about exploration and starts being about the transformation of our own species, which is a far stranger and more unsettling thing. The tools for this are not science fiction. They already exist in early form. We now have the ability to edit genes to reach into the instruction manual inside our cells and rewrite it, adding, removing, and changing the code that makes a living thing what it is. The technique is real, it is here, and it is improving rapidly. Space agencies have already begun quietly exploring it, even testing gene editing techniques aboard the space station, because they understand that radiation damage to our DNA is one of the great barriers to long journeys, and gene editing is, at its heart, a way of managing DNA. The most basic version of the idea is almost gentle. If radiation constantly breaks the traveller's DNA, perhaps we could give them cells that repair themselves better, that shrug off the damage that would cripple an ordinary person. Repairing damage is one thing, but the idea does not stop at repair. Consider one of the most remarkable discoveries in this field. There is a creature on Earth, microscopic, almost comically sturdy, nicknamed the water bear, that can survive things that should be impossible. It can be dried out completely, frozen nearly to absolute zero, blasted with radiation, even exposed to the raw vacuum of space, and it comes back to life. Part of its secret is a special protein it produces that shields its DNA from harm, and in the year 2016, scientists took the gene for that protein out of the water bear and put it into human cells in a laboratory. The result was extraordinary. Those human cells became markedly more resistant to radiation, on the order of 40% more protected against the kind of damage that space radiation inflicts. Read that again. We have already, in a dish, made human cells partly radiation-proof by borrowing a gene from another animal. The door to redesigning ourselves is not locked. It is standing ajar. Now follow that thought out to where it leads, all the way out, because this is where it becomes genuinely dizzying. If we can borrow a gene to resist radiation, why stop there? A world that is deathly cold might call for genes borrowed from creatures that thrive in ice. A world with little oxygen might call for changes to how the body uses what little there is. A dim world under dust-choked skies might call for better eyes. Some scientists who study this seriously have written openly about a future in which humans headed for other worlds are deliberately engineered for those worlds, given traits assembled from the whole catalogue of life on Earth, and perhaps eventually traits written from scratch. The human being who could actually thrive on Mars in this vision is not quite the human being reading these words. They are something adjacent to us, something adapted, something new. And here is the thought that I find almost impossible to hold steady in my mind. Imagine the first child conceived to live on Mars, engineered before birth to survive there, given whatever combination of borrowed and rewritten genes it would take to endure the cold and the radiation and the thin, poisoned world. Imagine that child growing up under a pink sky, in a body designed for a gravity of 38%, in cells hardened against a radiation that would sicken you or me. Now imagine what that means, fully. That child, built for Mars, might never be able to survive on Earth. The full gravity of our world could be too much for a body shaped for a lighter one. The rich, thick, oxygen-heavy air might not suit lungs tuned for something else. The blue planet that made our entire species the only home life has ever known could be as hostile to that Mars-born child as Mars is hostile to us. Sit with the vertigo of that. A human being, or something descended from a human being, for whom Earth itself is the alien and deadly world, and Mars is the only home. A person with no Earth to return to, not because the door is locked, but because they were never made to walk through it in the first place. This is the point where the whole endeavour collides with a question we're not remotely prepared to answer, which is not whether we can do it, but whether we should. Editing the genes of a person before they are born, deciding in advance what traits they will have, what they will be able to survive and what they will never be able to return to, is one of the most profound powers a species could ever grasp, and we are only beginning to hold it. On Earth, the very idea is fenced round with great caution and hard ethical lines, and for good reason. We have already seen what happens when someone crosses those lines recklessly, editing human embryos in secret and bringing them to birth, an act that was met with alarm and condemnation across the world. The knowledge is real, but our wisdom about how to use it lags far behind, and the stakes could not be higher. To engineer a human being for Mars is not a technical footnote to the mission. It is a decision about what our descendants will be permitted to become, made on their behalf, before they can speak. And notice how neatly this closes the circle we have been tracing all night. We began by describing a trap built from physics and biology, a set of walls that no amount of courage could push through. And now we find that the only apparent way out of that trap, the only path to a human that could truly live on Mars, requires us to change the human itself, to trade away the body's birthright on Earth in exchange for a foothold on another world. The escape from the trap is itself a kind of transformation into a being for whom the trap is simply home. There is a hope in that, a real and serious hope that life, given enough ingenuity and enough time, can spread even to a place as pitiless as Mars. But it is a hope that asks us to accept that the ones who finally belong there will not be quite like us, and will be as unable to come home to Earth as we would be unable to survive on Mars. The problem is not solved so much as inherited, handed down to a new kind of person built to carry it. That is the final, strangest turn of the trap. There may indeed be a way to truly live on Mars, but the price of it is that the thing which lives there is no longer quite us. To beat the fate we have described all night, the fate of the fragile human body that cannot survive the journey or the destination, we may have to stop sending the fragile human body at all, and start sending something engineered, something changed, something that has traded its birthright on Earth for a foothold on Mars. The trap does not simply close on the first travellers, it reaches forward into their descendants, and quietly rewrites what those descendants are. There is a kind of hope in this, a real one. It says that Mars is not necessarily beyond us forever, that life, clever and stubborn, might find a way. But it is a hope with a shadow, and the shadow is a question we have never had to ask before. If the only way to belong to a new world is to stop belonging to the old one, if the only way to live out there is to become a creature that could never come home, then what exactly have we sent? And what in the end have we become? Which brings us at last all the way back to the beginning, to the person in the seat, looking out the window at a blue world. It is time to name the fate we have spent all night circling. We have come a long way tonight, the long way around, just as I promised at the start. We began with a single person in a seat, looking out a small round window at the world that made them, understanding they were seeing it for the last time, and now, after everything, after the locked door and the silent tide and the forgetting body and the shrinking heart, and the world that resists a home and the mind in the trap and the strange possibility of ceasing to be quite human, It is time to say plainly what all of it adds up to. It is time to name the fate of the first human beings to reach Mars, and I think we can name it now, honestly, without flinching, because we have earned the right to it by looking so carefully at every piece. The fate is this. The first humans to reach Mars are almost certainly going there to stay. Not as a choice made in a moment of bravery, though it would take enormous bravery. Not as a plot twist or a tragedy imposed from outside, but as a quiet consequence of what human bodies are and what the two worlds are. The journey out changes the traveller along curves that make return dangerous or impossible. The destination offers no gravity to heal them and no shield to protect them. The rocket that would carry them home does not yet exist, and may not be buildable in time, and even if it were, the body that would ride it may no longer survive the strain, and the world they arrive on refuses patiently and completely to become the self-sustaining home the dream promised. Every path back is blocked, and every path forward leads deeper into a place that was never made for them. That is not a temporary hardship. For the first ones, it is very likely permanent. They go, and they remain, and they end their lives beneath a pink sky, 200 million kilometers from everything that made them. I called it terrifying in the very framing of tonight, and I stand by that word because it is genuinely terrifying to contemplate a fate with no door out. But I want to be careful, here at the end, to say the other true thing alongside it, because a fate can be terrifying and still not be only terror. There is something else woven through this, something I can only call dignity. The first Martians would be the first human beings in the entire history of life on Earth to belong to another world. Not to visit it, to belong to it, to live and die as citizens of a planet that is not the one their species was born on. They would be exiles, yes, cut off from home by their own transformed bodies. But they would also be pioneers in the fullest sense the word has ever held, the first of us to plant not a flag but a life on ground beyond the Earth. And every one of them would have known. That is the part I keep returning to, the part that turns the terror into something more complicated and more human. They boarded knowing. Think about that phrase now, at the very end, with everything we have learned behind it. When I first said it, back at the launch pad, it was a foreboding, a shadow over a hopeful scene. They boarded knowing, and it sounded like doom. But look at it now. To board a ship, understanding that the door will lock behind you, that your bones will thin and your heart will shrink, that the world you are going to will resist your every attempt to live in it, that you will very likely never again stand on the blue point of light that holds everyone you love, and to strap yourself into the seat anyway, calmly, willingly, for the sake of being first, for the sake of the ones who come after, for the sake of reaching, that is not the act of a victim. That is one of the most remarkable things a human being could ever choose to do. They boarded knowing. It began as the sound of a trap closing. It ends as the sound of a decision, made with open eyes, into the dark. It is worth pausing on that word fate, because we have arrived at it honestly, and we should understand exactly what we mean by it. A fate is not the same as a mere danger. A danger is something that might happen, that you might avoid with skill or luck. A fate is something written more firmly than that, a destination set by the nature of things, waiting at the end of the road no matter how well you walk it. What we have uncovered tonight is closer to the second than the first. It is not that the first Martians might, through bad luck, fail to return. It is that the return is foreclosed by the very structure of the journey and the destination, by what bodies are and what the two worlds are. Change the luck, and the fate remains. That is why the word fits, and why it carries such weight. We are not describing a risk that careful planning could erase. We are describing a consequence that follows from the facts themselves, as surely as cold follows nightfall. And there is a particular kind of courage in naming a fate plainly, rather than looking away from it, which is what our stories usually do. The brochures and the paintings look away. They show the clean suits and the glowing domes and the flag in the sand, and they let us imagine that the person in the picture will finish their adventure and come home to tell it. Looking at the whole truth instead, the locked door and the dissolving body and the world that will not become a home, is harder and heavier, and it asks more of us. But it also honours the ones who would go far more than any painting does, because it takes the measure of what they would actually be giving and what they would actually be choosing with open eyes. To name their fate truthfully is the least we owe them, and perhaps the most. I want to be fair, here at the end, to the people who would tell this story differently, because there are many of them, and some are very serious and very brilliant. There are those who look at every obstacle we have described tonight and see not a wall but a to-do list. The radiation, they would say, is an engineering problem, to be solved with better shielding and smarter habitats. The failing body is a medical problem, to be solved with drugs and spinning ships and eventually edited genes. The unbuildable return rocket is a challenge to be met with enough iteration and enough will. To them, the word impossible is just a word for something we have not figured out yet, and human history is a long parade of impossible things that became ordinary. I have real respect for that view. It is the view that gets things built. Without it, we would never have left the ground at all. But I would gently point out where the two visions actually disagree, because it is easy to miss. The optimists are almost always talking about transportation, about how to move mass and machines and people across space more cheaply and more often, and they are making genuine, extraordinary progress on exactly that. But moving the body to Mars was never the hardest part of this story. The hardest part is what happens to the body once it is there, and what the planet is when you arrive, and those are not transportation problems. They are problems of physiology and chemistry, of what flesh can endure and what a poisoned, airless, low-gravity world will allow. A cheaper rocket does not give the heart back the strength it lost, or thicken the Martian air, or unfreeze the water, or shield the DNA. The two camps are often not even arguing about the same thing. One is solving the problem of getting there, the other is describing the problem of being there, and the fate of the first travellers is written not in the getting there, which we are steadily conquering, but in the being there, which we have barely begun to face. And so I leave you with the image we started with, changed now by everything in between. The person in the seat, looking out the window at Earth. Only now, imagine it from the other direction. Imagine them years later, standing on the surface of Mars in the cold of a Martian morning, looking up at that same Earth, no longer a whole world filling a window but a single blue point of light low in the dawn. Everyone they ever loved is on that point. They will never touch it again, and they knew that. They knew all of it before they ever left. Whether that is the saddest thing you have ever heard, or the bravest, or somehow both at once, I will leave for you to decide in the quiet as you drift. The fate of the first humans to reach Mars is to belong, forever, to another world, and to have chosen it, knowing. That is the terror of it, and that, strangely, is also the grace of it. Rest easy tonight. You are still here, on the blue point of light, under a sky thick enough to breathe and a gravity strong enough to hold you. It is a rarer and more precious thing than we ever remember to notice. Sleep well,